The winter of 1895 was unforgiving along the Carolina mountains. Snow fell in thick curtains across the Blue Ridge, turning the wilderness into a kingdom of ice and silence. But deep within those frozen hills, something impossible was rising. A palace, not a house, not an estate, but a monument to a kind of power America had never seen before. 250 rooms, 4 acres of floor space. A building so vast that its own architect warned it might never be finished. And at the center of it all stood a young man who had inherited more money than most nations possessed. His name was George Vanderbilt, and he was building the largest private home in American history. But this story is not about what he built. It is about why it could not last. The Gilded Age was an era of extremes. While millions of Americans lived in tenements and worked 16-hour days for pennies, a small circle of families accumulated wealth beyond imagination. The Vanderbilts were at the apex of that circle. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the patriarch, had died in 1877 as the richest man in America, leaving behind a fortune of over $100 million. In today's terms, that would be worth hundreds of billions. His descendants did not merely inherit money, they inherited an empire. If you're fascinated by the rise and fall of America's wealthiest dynasties and want to see how this story unfolds, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on whether such extreme wealth can ever truly last. By the 1880s, the Vanderbilt family was operating on a scale that defied comprehension. They owned railroads that connected entire regions. They controlled shipping lanes. They possessed art collections that rivaled European royalty. And they built homes that were not meant to be lived in, so much as displayed. The Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island. Marble House. Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. These were not residences. They were declarations. Statements carved in limestone and marble that said, "We are untouchable." George Vanderbilt was different from his brothers. Where they pursued business and expansion, he pursued culture. He was quiet, scholarly, a collector of rare books and European art. He spoke 8 languages. He had toured the great estates of England and France, walked through the chateaux of the Loire Valley, studied the architecture of the Renaissance, and when he decided to build his own estate, he wanted something that would surpass them all. He chose the mountains of North Carolina, purchased 125,000 acres of land, and hired the finest architect in America. Richard Morris Hunt had designed mansions for the Astors and the Belmonts, but Biltmore would be his masterpiece. Construction began in 1889. Thousands of workers were brought in. Entire forests were cleared. A private railway was built just to transport materials to the site. Italian stonemasons, European craftsmen, landscape architects, engineers. The project consumed everything around it. The nearby town of Asheville transformed almost overnight. Hotels appeared, restaurants opened. The local economy became entirely dependent on the construction of one man's house. Inside Biltmore, the scale was overwhelming. A banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling. A library that held 23,000 volumes, an indoor pool, a bowling alley, 65 fireplaces, electric lights and central heating, technologies so new that most of America had never seen them. George Vanderbilt filled the rooms with treasures, paintings by Renoir and Whistler, tapestries from the 16th century, furniture that had once belonged to Napoleon. Every corner of the house was a museum. But while Biltmore rose in the mountains, something else was rising across America. Anger. The workers who built the railroads, the miners who extracted the coal, the factory laborers who produced the goods that made men like Vanderbilt wealthy. They were beginning to ask questions. Why should one family live in a house with 250 rooms while their children starved? Why should wealth be passed down like a birthright while millions struggled for survival? The labor movement was growing. Strikes were becoming more frequent, more violent. In 1892, just as Biltmore neared completion, the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania turned into a battle. Workers fought against Pinkerton agents hired by industrialists. People died. The country was fracturing. The Vanderbilts and families like them believed they were above such conflicts. They moved through society in a bubble of privilege so complete that the struggles of ordinary people seemed almost abstract. They threw parties that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt once hosted a ball where guests dressed as European royalty and wore jewels worth millions. The New York Times described it in obsessive detail. The public read those descriptions with a mixture of fascination and rage. George Vanderbilt opened Biltmore on Christmas Eve 1895. His family and friends arrived by private train. They wandered through the rooms in awe. But outside those walls, the world was changing in ways they could not control. The economic panic of 1893 had devastated the country. Banks failed. Railroads went bankrupt. Unemployment soared, and yet the mansions kept rising. The Vanderbilts kept building. It was as if they believed their wealth made them immune to the forces reshaping America. What they did not understand was that their power was not permanent. It was not even entirely real. The Vanderbilt fortune was built on railroads, and railroads were already becoming obsolete. New technologies were emerging: the automobile, the airplane. Industries were shifting, and more importantly, the political landscape was turning against them. The progressive era was beginning. Reformers were demanding change. They wanted to break up monopolies, regulate corporations, tax the wealthy. Journalists were exposing the brutal conditions in factories and mines. Books like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle revealed the horrors hidden behind America's industrial wealth. The public was waking up. The Vanderbilts tried to adapt. George Vanderbilt turned Biltmore into a model of scientific forestry. He hired Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. They managed the land sustainably, replanted trees, created what was essentially America's first managed forest. It was a noble effort, but it could not change the fundamental reality. The age of unchecked wealth was ending. The first blow came from taxation. For most of American history, there was no income tax. The wealthy paid almost nothing to the federal government, but in 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified. Income tax became legal. Suddenly, maintaining a fortune required constant management. Then came the estate tax. When wealthy individuals died, a significant portion of their wealth would be claimed by the government. The mechanisms that had allowed the Vanderbilts to pass down their empire intact were being dismantled, but the real destruction came from within. The second and third generations of Vanderbilts did not have the ruthlessness of Cornelius. They had been raised in luxury. They knew how to spend money, not how to make it. They threw themselves into high society, into parties and yachts and European titles. They married into aristocracy, believing that social prestige could replace financial discipline. It could not. One by one, the mansions became unsustainable. The cost of maintaining a house like the Breakers was staggering. Dozens of servants, constant repairs, heating bills that could bankrupt a small business, property taxes that climbed every year. And the Vanderbilt fortune, as vast as it had been, was being divided among more and more heirs. Cornelius had left his wealth primarily to one son, but that son had many children, and those children had many children. The fortune fragmented. By the 1920s, the cracks were visible. Some Vanderbilts sold their mansions. Others tried to hold on, cutting staff, closing off wings of their homes, struggling to maintain appearances. The Great Depression delivered the final blow. Wealth that had seemed eternal evaporated. Investments collapsed. The stock market crash of 1929 destroyed fortunes overnight. And the Vanderbilts, who had always believed they were too powerful to fail, discovered they were not. George Vanderbilt had died in 1914, just 19 years after opening Biltmore. He never saw the full collapse of his world. His widow, Edith, tried to keep the estate running. She opened parts of it to the public during the Depression, charging admission to help pay the bills. It was a humiliating necessity. The house that had been built as a private palace was now a tourist attraction. But even that was not enough. The costs were too high, the taxes too steep. In 1930, Edith sold off 86,000 acres of the original estate to the federal government. It became Pisgah National Forest. The Vanderbilt empire was being dismantled piece by piece. Other families faced the same fate. The Astors, the Belmonts, the Whitneys. The great mansions of Newport stood empty. Some were torn down, others were converted into museums or hotels. The era of the mega mansion was over, not because people stopped wanting to be wealthy, but because the conditions that had allowed such concentrated wealth no longer existed. Taxation, regulation, economic volatility, social change. The world had moved on. There is a photograph from 1930 that captures the end of an era. It shows Marble House in Newport, one of the grandest Vanderbilt mansions, sitting empty. The windows are dark. The grounds are overgrown. No servants walk the halls. No guests arrive for glittering parties. The house is a monument to a dead world. And across America, dozens of similar mansions were meeting the same fate. But the story does not end with decay. It ends with a question that America is still asking. What happens when wealth becomes so concentrated that it disconnects from reality? The Vanderbilts were not evil. They were not monsters. George Vanderbilt genuinely loved art and culture. He employed thousands of people. He contributed to conservation efforts. But his wealth existed in a separate universe from the lives of ordinary Americans. And that separation, that vast distance between the palace and the tenement, created a tension that could not hold. The Progressive Era reformers understood this. They saw that unchecked capitalism led to extremes that threatened democracy itself. When a few families controlled more wealth than entire states, when workers had no protections and no voice, the system became unstable. The reforms of the early 20th century, the income tax, the estate tax, labor laws, antitrust regulations, these were not acts of socialism. They were attempts to preserve capitalism by making it sustainable, to prevent the kind of revolution that had torn apart other nations, and for a time it worked. The mid-20th century saw a more balanced distribution of wealth. The middle class grew. Labor unions gave workers bargaining power. The tax code was progressive, meaning the wealthy paid a higher percentage. The gap between rich and poor, while still significant, was not as grotesque as it had been during the Gilded Age. The mega mansions disappeared, replaced by suburban homes and middle-class prosperity. But history does not move in straight lines. By the 1980s, the reforms of the Progressive Era were being reversed. Tax rates on the wealthy were slashed. Regulations were rolled back. Unions were weakened, and wealth began to concentrate again. Not in the same way, not in the same hands, but the pattern was familiar. A small number of individuals and families accumulating resources on a scale that defied comprehension. Today, there are individuals who possess wealth that would make even Cornelius Vanderbilt seem modest. And with that wealth comes the same questions. How long can such an equality last? What are the consequences of allowing it to grow unchecked? The Vanderbilt mansions still stand, most of them, but they are no longer homes. Biltmore is a tourist destination, visited by over 1 million people every year. The Breakers is a museum, preserved by a historical society. These buildings are beautiful. They are testaments to human craftsmanship and ambition. But they are also warnings. They remind us that no amount of wealth can insulate anyone from the forces of history. That power built on inequality is fragile, that every Gilded Age eventually ends. The workers who built Biltmore were paid low wages. Many of them lived in company housing. Their names were not recorded. Their stories were not preserved. They are forgotten, while George Vanderbilt's name endures. But without them, the mansion would not exist. This is the paradox at the heart of the Vanderbilt story. Great wealth requires the labor of many, but the rewards flow to very few. And when that imbalance becomes too extreme, the system that created it begins to collapse. The collapse of the Vanderbilt dynasty was not a single event. It was a slow unraveling that played out over decades, across generations, in boardrooms and courtrooms and family estates that grew quieter each year. By the 1940s, the once mighty railroad empire that Cornelius Vanderbilt had built was in decline. The trains that had made him the richest man in America were losing ground to automobiles and airplanes. The monopolies that had seemed eternal were broken by antitrust laws, and the family that had ruled American high society was fragmenting under the weight of its own excess. The later Vanderbilts tried to hold on. They sold assets, they downsized estates, they married into European aristocracy, believing that titles and prestige could replace lost fortune. Consuelo Vanderbilt, the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt, was forced into a marriage with the Duke of Marlborough in 1895. It was a transaction, American money for a British title. She was miserable. The marriage eventually ended in divorce, but it illustrated how the Vanderbilts were thinking. They were trying to cement their status through social connections, not understanding that the foundation beneath them was crumbling. One of the most revealing moments in Vanderbilt history came in 1947 during a family reunion. Over 100 descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt gathered at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. A newspaper reporter attended and later wrote that not a single millionaire was among them. The fortune, which had once exceeded $100 million, had dissipated entirely. Some family members were comfortable, others were struggling, but none possessed the kind of wealth that had defined the name Vanderbilt. In less than 70 years, one of the greatest American fortunes had vanished. How does this happen? How does wealth on such a scale simply disappear? The answers are multiple and interconnected. First, there is the mathematical reality of inheritance. Cornelius Vanderbilt left his fortune primarily to one son, William, but William had 8 children, and those 8 children had dozens of children. Each generation split the wealth further. Without new sources of income to replace what was being divided, the fortune shrank with each passing. Second, there is the issue of taxation. The estate tax, introduced in 1916, took a significant percentage of wealth each time it passed from one generation to the next. For families like the Vanderbilts, who had accumulated their wealth in an era of virtually no taxation, this was devastating. Every death in the family meant a massive transfer of assets to the government. The mechanisms that had allowed dynastic wealth to perpetuate itself were being systematically dismantled. Third, there is the problem of spending. The Vanderbilts lived extravagantly. They maintained multiple homes. They employed armies of servants. They traveled in private rail cars and yachts. They threw parties that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. This kind of spending is sustainable only if wealth continues to grow. But the Vanderbilt wealth was not growing. The railroad industry was in decline. Investments were producing diminishing returns, and the family's expenses far exceeded their income. Fourth, there is the issue of competence. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a ruthless businessman who understood leverage, competition, and expansion. He built his empire through strategic thinking and relentless ambition. But his descendants were not trained for that kind of work. They were raised in luxury, educated in art and culture, groomed for high society. They did not know how to run railroads or manage investments. They hired advisors, trusted the wrong people, made poor decisions. The skills that created the fortune were not passed down with the money. And finally, there is the external world. The early 20th century was a period of massive change. 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the rise of labor movements, the introduction of income and estate taxes, antitrust legislation, the regulatory state, the conditions that had allowed the Gilded Age fortunes to flourish no longer existed. The Vanderbilts were operating in a world that was fundamentally hostile to concentrated dynastic wealth. But the end of the Vanderbilt era was not just an economic story. It was a cultural shift. The values that had celebrated the robber barons were changing. The idea that vast wealth was a sign of virtue, that the rich deserved their fortunes because of superior talent or work ethic, was being challenged. Progressives argued that extreme wealth was often the result of exploitation, monopoly, and political corruption. They pointed to the brutal working conditions in Vanderbilt-owned industries. They documented the violence used to suppress labor organizing. They showed how laws were written to favor the wealthy and punish the poor. This shift in public consciousness mattered. During the Gilded Age, newspapers had breathlessly reported on the parties and mansions of the rich. The public had consumed these stories with a mixture of envy and admiration. But by the 1930s, the tone had changed. The same newspapers were now running exposés on tax evasion and corporate greed. The same public was demanding accountability. The cultural permission for extreme displays of wealth had been revoked. The mansions themselves became symbols of this change. When the Breakers was donated to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948, it was with the understanding that it would be open to the public as a museum. The Vanderbilts, who still lived there, retained some rooms, but most of the house was no longer private. Tourists walked through the ballrooms and dining halls, marveling at the excess. But there was a melancholy to the experience. These were not living spaces, they were relics. The world they represented was gone. Biltmore managed to survive, but only by transforming itself into a business. George Vanderbilt's grandson, William Cecil, took over management in 1960 and turned the estate into a tourist destination. He opened a winery, he hosted events, he marketed the house aggressively. It worked. Biltmore became profitable, but it was no longer a family home. It was a brand. The Vanderbilt name had become a commodity, valuable only insofar as it could attract paying visitors. Other mansions were not so fortunate. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's Fifth Avenue mansion in New York, once the largest private residence in the city, was demolished in 1927. It was replaced by a department store. The symbolism was stark. The palace of the richest family in America had become a place where the middle class shopped for clothes. Marble House in Newport was saved only because it was donated to charity. The Elms, another Newport mansion, was nearly torn down before preservationists intervened. Across the country, the monuments to Gilded Age wealth were disappearing. Why should we care about the fall of the Vanderbilts? They were, after all, extraordinarily privileged. They lived lives of unimaginable comfort while millions suffered. Their decline seems like justice, or at least inevitability. But their story matters because it reveals something fundamental about wealth and power in America. It shows that no fortune, no matter how large, is permanent. That economic and political forces can dismantle even the most entrenched dynasties, and that the choices a society makes about taxation, regulation, and labor rights have profound consequences. The reforms of the progressive era were not accidents. They were the result of decades of activism, organizing, and political struggle. Workers fought for the right to unionize. Journalists exposed corruption. Politicians, responding to public pressure, enacted laws that limited corporate power and redistributed wealth. These changes did not happen because the wealthy decided to be generous. They happened because ordinary people demanded them, and the results were significant. The mid-20th century, the period between the New Deal and the 1980s, saw the most equitable distribution of wealth in American history. It was not perfect. Inequality still existed. But the gap between rich and poor was narrower than it had been during the Gilded Age or than it would become later. Working-class families could afford homes. Education was accessible. Social mobility was real. This was the world that the fall of the Vanderbilts helped create. Their decline was part of a larger rebalancing, but that rebalancing did not last. Starting in the 1980s, many of the policies that had constrained wealth began to be reversed. Tax rates on the highest earners were slashed. Regulations on corporations were rolled back. Unions lost power, and wealth began to concentrate again. Today, the United States has levels of inequality comparable to the Gilded Age. A small number of individuals control vast fortunes. They own multiple homes, private jets, yachts. They influence politics through lobbying and campaign contributions. They operate in a sphere separate from ordinary life. The parallels to the Vanderbilt era are obvious and unsettling. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The same patterns of wealth concentration, political influence, and public resentment are emerging again, and the same questions are being asked. How much inequality can a democracy sustain? When does wealth become so concentrated that it undermines the social contract? What are the consequences of allowing a small elite to accumulate power while the majority struggles? The Vanderbilts believed they were building a legacy that would last forever. They constructed monuments in stone and marble, filled them with treasures, established trusts and foundations. But within 3 generations their fortune was gone. The mansion stood empty. The name Vanderbilt became a historical curiosity rather than a symbol of living power. This is not because they were uniquely foolish or wasteful. It is because maintaining dynastic wealth across generations is extraordinarily difficult, especially when the political and economic environment is hostile to it. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on, because in the next video we'll explore how today's billionaires are trying to avoid the fate of the Vanderbilts and whether they'll succeed. Like this video if you found it eye-opening, and comment below with your thoughts on wealth, legacy, and whether extreme fortune should even exist. Today's billionaires study the mistakes of the Gilded Age families. They structure their wealth differently, using trusts and foundations that can persist across generations. They invest in technology and innovation rather than railroads and real estate. They are more careful about public perception, engaging in philanthropy and branding themselves as innovators rather than aristocrats. But they face the same fundamental challenges: taxation, regulation, public opinion, and the mathematical reality that wealth divided among heirs shrinks over time. Some are trying to circumvent these challenges through legal structures, family offices, offshore accounts, dynasty trusts that can last hundreds of years. Others are betting on technology, believing that if they control the platforms and systems that define the future, their power will be unchallengeable. But history suggests otherwise. The Vanderbilts controlled the railroads, the essential infrastructure of their time. It was not enough. The Rockefellers controlled oil. The Carnegies controlled steel. All of them believed their dominance was permanent. All of them were wrong. What destroyed the Vanderbilt fortune was not any single factor, but a combination of internal weaknesses and external pressures. The family's inability to adapt, the changing economic landscape, the political reforms that limited concentrated wealth, the cultural shift that stopped celebrating extreme inequality. These forces worked together, slowly at first, then with accelerating speed. By the time the Vanderbilts realized what was happening, it was too late. There is a lesson here about impermanence, about the fragility of power, about the fact that wealth, no matter how vast, exists within a social and political context that can change. The Vanderbilts were not brought down by revolution or violence. They were brought down by democracy, by a society that decided extreme inequality was unacceptable and enacted laws to limit it. This is a profoundly important point. It means that the distribution of wealth is not inevitable or natural. It is a choice that societies make. The mansions remain. You can visit them. You can walk through the rooms where Vanderbilts once entertained presidents and royalty. You can see the art they collected, the furniture they imported, the luxuries they surrounded themselves with. But the people are gone. The fortune is gone. The power is gone. What remains is a memory and a warning. The warning is this: no amount of wealth makes anyone immune to history. The forces that shape society, the movements of workers, the demands for justice, the changes in technology and economy, these forces are more powerful than any individual fortune. The Vanderbilts learned this. Other Gilded Age families learned this. And those who are accumulating vast wealth today would be wise to remember it. The Vanderbilt era ended not with a bang, but with a slow fade. The last of the great mansions closed. The last of the fortunes dissipated. The family name persisted, but without the power that had once made it synonymous with American aristocracy. And in that ending, there is something almost poetic. The houses built to last forever stood for less than a century as private homes. The wealth accumulated over a lifetime vanished in 3 generations. The dynasty that seemed eternal proved to be as temporary as everything else, and so we returned to where we began. A palace in the mountains, 250 rooms, 4 acres of floor space, built by a man who believed he was creating something permanent. Biltmore still stands, but not as George Vanderbilt imagined it. It is a business now, a tourist attraction, a reminder of a world that no longer exists. The visitors who walk its halls are not the elite of society, but ordinary people, paying admission to see how the other half once lived. The age of mega mansions ended because the world changed, because democracy pushed back against oligarchy, because taxes and regulations made it impossible to maintain such concentrated wealth, because new generations did not have the ruthlessness or skill to preserve what their ancestors had built, because the very notion of a family living in a private palace while others struggled became culturally unacceptable. But perhaps most importantly, it ended because nothing lasts. Not wealth, not power, not dynasties. The Vanderbilts believed they were exceptional. They were not. They were subject to the same forces of change and decay that affect everything. Their mansions, magnificent as they are, stand now as monuments not to permanence but to impermanence. To the hubris of believing that any human creation can outlast the march of history. The snow still falls on the Blue Ridge Mountains. The palace still stands. But the world that created it is gone, and it is not coming back. That is the final truth of the Vanderbilt era. It was a moment, not a permanent condition. And like all moments, it passed.